Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark DiCarlo. Tonight my guest is Mr. Andrew Greenwell, who apparently is wearing a beard now. He's a local attorney, and what's the story on the beard?
You know, I don't know. I just decided to do it.
It's not...
There it is. I took Christmas to do it.
It doesn't itch?
No, it's way past
I
that
thought maybe,
stage.
you know, people have said that I look like you or something, so I thought maybe you were trying to hide that apparent resemblance.
That may be one of the advantages of having it that I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, it can't be mistaken. You know, I kind of go for the clean cut. I think of this. Isn't this like the Roman look, right?
Yes.
It's not like, you know, I think
so if you grow a beard, I'll shave mine. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Mr. Greenwell is has quite an interest in religious views, kind of almost an expert on Catholicism, I would call you. Do you think that's correct or incorrect?
Well, I don't know about an expert, but it's certainly a very important part of my life.
And I see your posts on Facebook. I see your posts, etc. And we have a new pope. I guess, is he still new? Pope Francis.
Pope Francis, yes.
And so when Pope Benedict resigned, was that without precedent or with precedent?
There had been some other instances historically of popes resigning. I think, I want to say Clement the Fifth or something, I can't remember what it is, but one of them had resigned before, and there had been some other instances of that happening. Nevertheless, in terms of the modern papacy, it was something entirely new. But the 1983 Code of Canon Law had anticipated it. There was a canon that specifically dealt with what the requirements were for a pope to resign, and he invoked those in his act of resignation. So I can't say that it was something lawless or anything like that. It was certainly legitimate. And
is there some sort of gossip about the real was the stated reason the real reason? I think the stated reason was health problems, and I think he did. There was a statement that Pope Benedict made that was rather ambiguous on its face, stating something, if I have done any sins, and some people think that was related to when he was, what was that, the Doctrine of the Faithful? He was the head of the
prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. But, you know, there's going to be rumors in any institution, especially the one the size of the Catholic Church, and I don't know if there's any rumors that are substantiated that would suggest that the reasons he gave were not the legitimate reasons. He seemed to have been very tired. He had suffered through some minor scandals, but which affected his papacy. I think that he felt that maybe he wasn't up to the burden. I think he's a very conscientious human being, and I think that he felt perhaps he expected too much of himself, and he thought that his powers were failing him. So I think that it was a legitimate concern for the church that drove him, and not something untoward or unexpressed.
But it was such a stark contrast to Pope John Paul II, who actually continued in the papacy, which many of us thought in a rather brave manner, despite his failing health, and who showed many of us that, you know, I guess if you have a mind to, that you could continue your career into whatever advanced age and failing health. It was such a stark contrast.
I agree, and people have taken both sides of that issue. You know, if you resign the papacy as if it were an office, then it seems to suggest that it's just kind of an office like every other, like the presidency or something. But there's something a little more sacred about the Petrine charism that would suggest that it ought to be something that's held for life. You look at the Pope as a father. The word Pope, in fact, comes from father, and so you don't expect your fathers to resign. And so there's a, you know, kind of two ways to look at it.
And there's like a Western tradition of, I don't know, the Caesars or something, or the...
Yeah, but I think the church's notion of the papacy is different from the Caesars and the Mafia Dons. I don't think the analogy is going to work very well. I would resist applying the Caesars and a Mafia Don to the papacy.
And then since I brought it up, even though I don't know much about the subject matter, have you followed the remarks by Pope Francis about the concern about the what's the Vatican Bank called? There's a name. It's not called the Vatican Bank. It's called.
I know what you're talking about, and I don't know offhand.
There's some concern about perhaps even dissolving it, etc., because of some problems.
You know, I haven't really kept up with it, so I'm not the guy to talk about it, but the Vatican banking system has always kind of been problematic. I think any financial system always is kind of problematic, and it's difficult to have checks and balances, so to speak, to use a bad pun. But in any event, I mean, I think that there's always been an effort to try to gain control over it. I think this Pope is very interested in doing that. I think he has assigned the Australian Cardinal, Cardinal Pell, to be in charge of it. And from my understanding of his personality, he's very aggressive. He's a large, tall, imposing person who will take the bull by the horns. So hopefully, whatever problems there are, they can work out.
Well, the Pope has made. I thought was very interesting, and of course, there's different. I don't remember if he said it in Italian or whatever, but I don't know the language that he stated it in. There's different interpretations. It was interesting. His original, it was ambiguous. He said, Pope Francis said, so you have to come to the ends of the earth to find yourself a pope. That was very, very interesting, and there was. I think some people took it as an indication that there was a problem in Rome getting a pope that wouldn't be somehow tainted by some sort of corruption regarding the Vatican Bank, etc., or the scandal.
You know, I didn't take it that way. I don't know for sure, but I would think that expression is an Argentinian expression. I mean,
well, that's interesting. That could be.
Argentina is way south. It's kind of away from everything, and so my hunch would be that that's just an Argentine expression that he imposed upon us.
Okay, well, that's
and you've got to think, I mean, he was the first non-European pope in a long, long time. So, I mean, and the first pope from the New World. So, yeah, they were reaching pretty far over the Atlantic.
And we were talking before the show. Actually, you had gone to South America, Central America recently, right?
I've been to Central America recently. I came back from Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, and have you been to Argentina too?
I went to Argentina once. I climbed a mountain there, Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the Western Hemisphere. And
again, since we were going to try to speak mostly about religious issues, you don't want to get off on too many tangents, but obviously our new Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and he isn't from Argentina.
That's right.
Right.
He has Italian background, Italian heritage. I think he's second generation of others. I think his grandparents came from Italy. He spoke Italian growing up, so he has an ability to speak Italian, but I think his lingua franca was, of course, Spanish.
Yep, I had thought that it was actually. There was some debate that whether or not he was actually born in Italy, but I think his parents were from there, and I thought maybe. I wouldn't say that they make political decisions when they're choosing the Pope. There's these rumors. There's rumors that they're political. And I thought maybe it was a good political decision in that obviously they haven't had an Italian pope in a while, and he's Italian, and he's from South America, so it could have been a political decision. But you tell me, you're the expert. I don't know.
You have 100 cardinals or so whatever in deciding. I'm sure every one of them thinks different things.
About the cardinals.
And so there's no way to predict what the conclave had thought.
Well, the conclave got a hard time recently, right? The 15 elements of the Vatican Curia, right?
Oh, the Curia, yeah.
Curia?
In December, I think, was it or January that he gave his talk to the Curia?
Pope Francis did. Is the Curia the same? Would that be the same group that picks the Pope?
No.
The Curia is more an administrative body then?
The Curia is the administrative arm of the Pope. Basically, the Pope has supreme jurisdiction over the Universal Church and over the Diocese of Rome. When it comes to his administration of the Universal Church, he's the supreme legislator, he's the supreme judge, he's the supreme executive. Obviously, one person can't do that all himself, so he has to find clergy or other educated people who can do that. And that's what the Curia is basically his cardinals, as well as others that are involved in exercising his executive power, his legislative power, and his judicial power.
So why is the Pope Francis, when you read, you may not want to say your opinion on some of this stuff, when you read about the 15 ailments of the Vatican Curia, according to Pope Francis, I'm looking at an article in the Washington Post, What did you think? Well, boy, he's not very happy with them, or he's not getting to do what he wants to do, or what were your thoughts? Or
Well,
you don't feel like you could say?
It's difficult for me to get a bead on Francis, and I'm not sure that anybody will ever get a bead on Francis. But from what I've been able to generalize, he has a very personal way of looking at things, a very concrete way, a very earthy way, a very pastoral way of looking at things. And so when he's talking about these things, it's unusual language, but I think it's very Jesuit language. I mean, one of the things that the Jesuits rely on is what's called an examen of conscience, which they do every evening. In fact, they do it at least twice a day, but in the evening is the main one. And they reflect back on what they've done that day, and they try to criticize and look at their conscience and try to figure out if certain vices have been extirpated, or if certain virtues have been increased or whatever. So, I mean, they look at their lives in detail that way. And I think when he's looking at the Curia, he's using the same techniques that he's applied internally in his spiritual life to the Curia. So whatever's in his soul, he's writ large in terms of analyzing the Curia. So the expressions that he uses are almost as if there's somebody that's talking to himself. That's how I saw it, at any rate.
Well, you know, here's what one thing that I thought of. Several things. Here was my thoughts. Is number one, boy, he's not very happy.
No, that is not a warm and fuzzy address.
No,
and I
think
think
not very happy. And I'm sorry.
No, I just.
He's not very happy. Number one, and number two, I guess if I were to, I'd probably have been more on like, not necessarily representing the status quo on anything in my life. Probably, probably more whatever, some background in whatever the counterculture or something, or maybe because my father, some sort of blue collar background or whatever. Having said that, when I read these remarks by Pope Francis, I kind of took the curious side in the situation, because I thought to myself, Pope Francis is going all over the world saying all kinds of stuff that it almost seems as if whatever comes to his mind he's saying. I thought that Pope John Paul II or Benedict, whenever they said something, it was very studied, it had precedent, it had authority, right? So, very well disciplined. In the same manner that even on this limited public access show, I just try not to shoot my mouth off and just say whatever comes into my mind. There's a filter. But some of the stuff that I've heard Pope Francis say, you're breeding like rabbits. And then I said, where? And then he comes back and then says, oh, well, no, 2 or 3 children, that's about right. Where's the precedent, the authority for these things? I'm thinking to myself, you're not, even a man like yourself, an attorney, and you come on this show, and you use some sort of social responsibility or something in what you say. And I think that I would think maybe the Curia, total supposition and conjecture, is saying, you can't, there's some misgivings when you speak off the cuff, when you're in a position of great authority, whether it's the president, whatever, it's a czar, whether it's the pope.
I think you're right. But in terms of the Curia, I think the relationship between a pope and his Curia is always going to be somewhat problematic. In a church the size of the Catholic Church, you got over 1 billion, is it 1.6 billion, I think, people. You've got a tremendous bureaucratic machinery that exists of necessity. But at the same time, the church isn't a bureaucratic structure. It's the kingdom of God here on earth. It's the body of Christ. It has a spiritual function, a spiritual society, and though it by necessity is incarnate, in other words, it's going to have to rely on human mechanisms, including a bureaucracy. You want to minimize those things, but you still have problems associated with that. So you have, the typical problems you have with bureaucrats. And the fact that you might be wearing a clerical collar doesn't change the fact that bureaucracies tend to be staid. They tend to, have their little turf wars and so forth. And I think that part of what he's trying to do is to address those issues and get people on board with his programs. And I think there is some resistance to not only his method of communication, which is new, and very difficult to deal with. People are still kind of off balance with respect to that. But I think some of the Curia is more liberal than he is, and some of the Curia is more conservative than he is, and so there's a lot of dynamism there. Yes, there's resistance or maybe an effort to push him. So,
one of the things as I was looking through these, I thought, well, a lot of these are on points. These are traits that you see in people in bureaucracies or employers, etc. The sickness of considering oneself immortal, immune, or indispensable. Excessive industriousness, which many lawyers are probably guilty of. Excessive planning and functionalism. But the problem, that when I was reading this stuff, I said, well, it all depends upon your, I guess, I don't know, your eye. You can take, whatever, Andrew Greenwell, and you could say, well, maybe somebody might say, maybe you're in shape, and maybe you're not heavy, so that's good because you have some discipline. Then someone else might look at you and say, oh, he's vain. That was the problem that I have. You could take any person's positive, right? Like industriousness. Well, he's excessive industriousness. Well, what about if you weren't industrious, then somebody would say you were lazy.
Correct.
You could, that's what I wondered about. I said, well, you could look at anybody, given the failings of man, and you could say this stuff.
I don't disagree with that. And so I think that's why I would characterize these things as sort of bullet points that he wants people to look at when they're looking at how they're performing. And ultimately, it's going to become a question of the standard, which depends on your vantage point and your conscience, and an effort to try to be honest with yourself. So, yeah, I mean, you may have different vantage points depending on a lot of factors, but I mean, I think the effort is to try to give these folks some guidance so that they can go back home, do their examens, and say, am I doing my job right? Am I too industrious? Am I forgetting prayer? Am I lazy? Or, am I concerned about my own turf? Or am I doing other things? Whatever it might be. I think those are effective ways of looking at how they're doing their task, with the notion that ultimately it comes up to their conscience and God and their own self-analysis as to where they fit.
Then that's interesting, and many of his remarks are interesting too. You're saying between the lines, though, that you're not necessarily have the misgivings that many, would you say, traditional Catholic or more conservative Catholics have against, Pope Francis. They have concerns about some of the things that he said about, they use the word gay now, about homosexual marriage or homosexuals generally, that there's some concern that he is changing the Church's position regarding some of these issues, whatever it is. And it's complex, some of what he's saying is, for example, that homosexuality being a sin, then he's saying, but when you see a homosexual, of course, you're supposed to welcome him, etc. So there's been some concern with the conservative Catholics, and even in regards to the actual Mass, which Pope Benedict found some favor with the Latin Mass, etc. And I don't think Pope Francis has a priority there.
No, and I can understand those, and I share those to a large degree because Pope Francis has been a non-traditional pope when it comes to his communication, and it creates some difficulty in trying to understand where he's coming from. And in a lot of his statements, he seems to almost contradict himself. And so it's creating an amount of uncertainty on both camps, really, because on the one hand, for example, he goes to the Philippines and he talks about the evils of artificial contraception and resisting the ideologies that are being imposed upon them. And then the more liberal Catholics go up in arms, the liberal press goes up in arms, and then on the other hand, then he starts talking about rabbits and 3 children being the only thing that's responsible, and then the more traditional Catholics say, well, look, you've just reversed yourself. And so he seems to be having difficulty at having a central message. It's almost like he's trying to please too many people at one time. And so he's created some real concern with the conservative and with the traditional group. And I think if you were to take his whole demeanor, his whole behavior, I think generally, and this is generalizing, the more liberal section of the church is happy with him, and the more conservative and the traditionalists are very concerned about his manner of expression and some of the things that he said.
Well, one of the issues that I don't understand, he doesn't, my opinion is he doesn't seem to know the duplicity of the media or the power of the media, and that you can't necessarily trust the media in representing what you said. In other words, for example, when he first said that he wasn't going to live in the what do they call the papal enclave, the papal apartment,
the papal palace versus the apartment.
That was interpreted to mean that he was going to live like some sort of a bohemian or a hippie, and that he was rejecting the actual opulence of the Vatican, and that there was no need for it, and therefore I'm negating it or condemning it. Well, that wasn't at all. It turns out that wasn't at all true. I guess that papal apartment is very modest, or relatively modest. It's relatively large, and the real reason that he moved is because he liked to be around people wanted to be around people.
That's the reason he gave. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's the reason he gave at the time, and I think that was the true reason. But whenever you speak to the media, and I don't know if you've had much experience with the media, right? I've had some trials and all this, right?
No, I'm not media savvy necessarily.
Okay, well, you got to be careful. you got to be careful. They'll take what you say. If they're covering a trial of yours, they'll misrepresent it. And you're talking, when you're the Pope, you're talking to secular people. They have an agenda. They're owned by corporations.
Sure.
And I mean, even myself, like I said, whenever during a trial or something, and this hasn't come up in a while, but you would have to watch what you'd say, that it couldn't be cut. And you have to, well, my opinion is sometimes you have to be willing to go to war. If they're hanging your client in the media, then you have to address it, right? Unfortunately. Because it takes a lot of time and you don't really get paid for it. You get publicity out of it, but I don't think that makes much difference. But nonetheless, you have to address it, but you have to watch what you say. And a lot of these people, they have an agenda. Your client's guilty, and we're going to show that he's guilty. We're going to show Mark DiCarlo's hand on a briefcase, clutching it while he's talking, as if he's nervous.
You know, but there's one thing about this Pope that I've also tried to, I think
yes.
I've generalized, and that is that he seems not to have a problem with disorder. In fact,
that's very interesting.
You remember when he did the World Youth Day in Brazil, he told the children, or the kids, the youth there, hace lío, do cause trouble. And he seems to be a person that doesn't mind that there's a little bit of disorder. He seems to be rather loose with respect to some of the liturgical laws or liturgical practices. He doesn't mind their disorder being there. He has made it clear in some of his talks that he thinks that rules are restrictive, that the laws, if they prevent, the gospel propagation, should be just basically thrown down. So he seems to be almost an antinomian against laws, against rules. He seems to be happy with kind of a disordered state of affairs, and maybe it comes from his pastoral practice at the slums in Argentina, where there is a lot of disorder. There's not a lot of law, and it's kind of a rough and tumble world, and that's where his main pastoral practice was.
That's an interesting insight. I haven't heard anybody state that, but isn't that attitude kind of antithetical to a patriarchal one-head government kind of structure? In other words, I thought that's what separated. Isn't Roman Catholicism separated from many of the Protestant religions by its adherence to a certain order and to doctrine and to certain religious doctrine?
I don't disagree with it, and I think that's part of the discontent, I think, among some of the groups with his behavior, because it really is, in a sense, non-papal, at least how we understood it traditionally. And maybe in some cases imprudent, maybe a little careless, and so forth. And so it has caused problems. There's some benefits associated with a lax style. It's very homey. I think it touches some people. But, I'm not convinced that if you weigh the benefits and the disadvantages of it, that the disadvantages have not outweighed the advantages.
And I can't intelligently discuss what Christ said and in the context of what he was saying it, but I don't know that it would be analogous, but it was very sparse, and it was very sparse and very on point. And I do think there's a well, you've said it well. There's some concerns about that issue, because sometimes it does look like it's contradictory in part. And what I thought of when I'm seeing this, it's kind of novel to see, because I'll be very frank, I didn't really follow before John Paul II. I probably don't have the familiarity with the papacy. Do you remember the Pope prior to John Paul II very well?
No.
Okay, I don't either. So I can't intelligently say anything, but when I'm reading what Pope Francis is doing, and I'm saying he's talking to the secular media, and I think they're misrepresenting what he's saying, is causing dissension. I don't even know if that's some of the stuff. When he said something about communing with nature could be your God, I'm thinking to myself, that's not even Christian.
Yeah,
I said, that's not Christian.
I don't think he quite said that.
Well, the way I read it in whatever secular media I wrote, I said, that's not even Christian. God created the heavens and the earth. You don't commune with nature. That's paganism. I'm freaking, I'm upset. And then I'm thinking to myself, is there a definition for the Pope? I'm thinking to myself, I said, maybe I should have asked Andrew to research it before he came on the show. Is what the Pope is supposed to be, is that defined somewhere?
Well, I think that the papal office is supposed to be one of confirming the brothers in the faith. So his office is less affirmative than negative. In other words, when there is a dispute that needs to be resolved, and there's a question of the application of the Gospels and tradition, which are sources of revelation, he's supposed to be there to preserve that and to confirm his brothers in the faith, not to do something new, not to exercise novelties and so forth. And to a certain extent, he doesn't seem to want to fit into that model. He calls himself the Bishop of Rome instead of the Pope and so forth. So it's like he's rejecting that. And yet at the same time, that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to be an anchor. He's not supposed to be somebody who stirs the pot and causes problems. He's supposed to be the centerpiece or the central focus that gives us unity. That's his charism or his gift, is to unify the bishops, unify the clergy, and unify the people of God under one sort of vicar of Christ. And if he's not doing that, then he's not really, in my opinion, being very effective as Peter.
One of the issues that is often used to attack the Catholic Church, I don't know why I find it funny, because I always hear the same thing about purgatory. Well, another one is the infallibility of the Pope. And since we're talking about the Pope and his role, they're saying, some groups like to say, no man can be infallible. But I think that, since we're talking about Pope Francis and some of his statements, I think that that is often misunderstood when the Pope is speaking with infallibility, and I think there's a phrase ex cathedra, etc. What is the explanation of the infallibility of the Pope, and whether or not he's speaking in that position as being infallible?
The definition of the infallibility of the Pope was worked throughout the ages. We believe that it is found in the Gospels when Jesus gives the ministry to Peter and changes his name from Simon to Peter, which is rock. And he says, upon this rock I will build my church. And that's the beginning of Peter's role as head of the apostles. In the scriptures, he is always named first. The others are always behind him, and so forth. And so as the church has developed that understanding of what did Jesus intend for Peter and then his successors, the bishops of Rome, to have. That's kind of developed over the period of time as we've reflected. And then the Vatican Council, the First Vatican Council in the 1800s, the precise whatever structure of that authority was defined. And basically it says that when a pope speaks in his capacity in the chair of Peter, in other words, in Peter's office, speaking for all the faithful in a matter of faith and morals, and holds a teaching to be revealed and definitive, need to be definitively held, then that statement would be protected by a gift of God, by God's own doing, by the Holy Spirit, from ever being in error. And it's part of the understanding that we have that the church will never be, as a whole, led into error, because the church has the Holy Spirit that's guiding it. Jesus promised the Holy Spirit who will guide us into all truth and so forth. And that Spirit, which is in the whole church, is in some way, in a special way, in the Pope, when he speaks in this limited, very limited circumstances. He can make mistakes on matters that are not having to do with the faith, on matters that have nothing to do with morals. For example, science. He can make mistakes when he's talking in private, or when he's giving a sermon, and when he's not speaking in his official capacity. So the power is rather restrictive, and it's there. It's kind of a negative power. It doesn't mean that he's an oracle and can make new truths. Quite the contrary, the power is specifically to preserve those truths that have been handed down to us by Jesus and by the apostles.
And do Catholics know when he's speaking from the position of infallibility? Is it?
Yes, there are certain formulas that the popes will use. Number one, they'll identify that they're speaking on behalf of all the Christian faithful, to all the church, and that they will use the word like define. Usually we will define X. When they say words like that, and then when they say that it's binding on all the faithful, and sometimes they'll invoke the authority of Peter, or the authority that Christ gave to Peter. When they do those kinds of things, then you have what I call the indicia, or the marks that you have a ex cathedra infallible statement. Most of those are very, very clear.
When was the last ex cathedra statement? Do you know? I mean, obviously you don't know these questions, and I don't want to put you. Do you know when one was recently made, or an important one that the audience might be familiar with?
There were actually several during the pontificate of John Paul II, although a lot of people don't recognize this. For example, he on the issue of women's ordination, if you will read I guess it was an encyclical or apostolical letter, I don't remember what format he used, but if you read the statements having to do with that, he makes it clear that as a matter of infallible teaching, that Jesus did not give the power to the church to ordain women. And so the ordination of priests is limited to men. That's an ex cathedra statement. It's irreformable. Also, in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, he uses his power and ex cathedra denounces certain moral infringements or violations against the Gospel of Life. The direct and intentional taking of a human life, abortion, the taking of a life at the end of life, through artificial means, through euthanasia and so forth. And those are all ex cathedra statements. So you've seen that power used by John Paul II in those two instances that I know of.
I see. And despite that, though, we do still hear, the beck and call for women's ordination. So I guess a lot of Catholics aren't necessarily in line with these statements.
No, but I think they're being disingenuous. I think that if you read the document, it fits all the requirements of the First Vatican Council for an infallible statement of the Pope. And I think that it was his intent, and it's clearly expressed in the language itself, that be held by all the faithful and be binding.
One of Pope Francis's controversial statements that I did agree with, had to do with the gospel of life. He did state something to the effect that we cannot just be the religion that is against abortion and against homosexual marriage and against birth control. And I was kind of in agreement when he stated that. In other words, he seemed to be stating that there was a too much emphasis placed in an almost radical manner on those issues. And I kind of thought, and he said something about the whole house of cards come tumbling down if we insist on this. And he wasn't rejecting those, but he did make that statement. Are you familiar with that?
I am, and I agree with that. I don't think he's rejecting those, and I think he's trying to get the focus on the central aspect of the gospel, which is that God became man in the person of Jesus and redeemed us and provided us a church that would guide us into all truth and so forth. That central feature of the gospel, that who Jesus Christ is and a relationship with him, is central. And you cannot understand anything having to do with the church's teachings of faith and morals unless you focus on that central sun. I mean, that's where our light comes from. And the conclusions that result from our discipleship of Christ include the commandments and what the commandments include. And so these things kind of trail. You don't become a disciple of anti-contraception or a disciple of anti-abortion. That's not what we are. We're disciples of Christ. And the reason we're disciples of Christ, in order to show our love for him, we also happen to have these moral standards which are taught by him. And it's our love of him and wanting to obey his commandments that make us do these things, and not the other way around.
That's very interesting. And that's kind of the way that I had interpreted what he had stated.
I think that's
as well.
what he means. Yeah.
And I would say that I think in the United States in particular, there was a certain amount of, what would you say, not persecution or whatever, but there were many priests that were of the opinion that voting for whatever President Obama was a sin because he was in favor of abortion or wasn't against abortion, and there was a lot of Catholics voting along just the life issues in regards politically. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I remember that being an issue.
You remember that being an issue?
And there is a division among the episcopacy in the United States as to how that should be handled. I think one position would be represented by Cardinal Burke of St. Louis, or was a Cardinal Archbishop of St. Louis, and the other one is Worrell of Washington, D.C., and how we should handle that. And I would agree with Cardinal Burke as to how that should be. In other words, what role do those life issues play in terms of politics, election, and the giving of Eucharist to politicians who take public sides, promoting abortion rights and so forth.
But there has been a dispute between Cardinal Burke allegedly and Pope Francis, and didn't Cardinal Burke in fact have some sort of was it a demotion or something as a result of an alleged controversy between Pope Francis and Cardinal Burke? Well, what was that controversy about?
We don't know if there's a controversy between Cardinal Burke and Pope Francis. What we do know is that Pope Francis removed Cardinal Burke from 3 positions of influence in the Curia, and then basically gave him kind of a bone. It wasn't very much, but Cardinal Burke was basically head of the Supreme Court. It's called the Apostolic Signatura, which is he's a canon lawyer. He's a brilliant human being, a very fine human being, a very good cardinal, priest, archbishop, and then he was also a member of the Congregation for Bishops, which decides the bishops. And since he was the American representative, he would have a large say in the appointment of bishops by the Pope. And then he was also, I think, on the Congregation for the Causes of Saints or something like that. And those 3 offices were removed from him. He was put in those offices by Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis took those away. And so it's an indication that Cardinal Burke looks at things in a way that Pope Francis disagrees.
I'm sorry, but I thought there was a specific controversy that came out, and I can't recall what was it.
But following those decisions by the Pope, had been announced. Then you had the October Synod in 2014, where the family life issues and human sexuality issues and gay marriage issues were discussed, and Cardinal Burke took a very strong traditional approach with respect to those questions, and was kind of the leader of those along with some other cardinals. And there's some suggestions that some of his comments were rather pointed against the Pope and criticizing the Pope as to how he handled that synod process.
I see. And Cardinal Burke where's he a cardinal?
Well, he was. I think he came from, I want to say Wisconsin or something like that, and he was made Archbishop Cardinal of St. Louis, and then he became a member of the Roman Curia. So lived in Rome.
Some of my notes, too, I was curious about this issue, and I don't know that it would apply to Cardinal Burke, at least as of yet. But there has been some, you hear about the history of, prosecution or persecution, right, in the church, and obviously the one that they like to bring out all the time is Galileo. Well, Galileo was persecuted. I never found that to be, a big deal. I don't know. I think it was house arrest or something. Really,
it was pretty.
Yeah, it was
mild.
Pretty mild. And I think that all he had to do was make a statement stating that you have to say is God is the head of the universe or something, and that's all they really wanted.
It had to do with whether the heliocentric theory or whatever. And it's very, very complicated, and it's used basically to beat the church. And I think the church was generally quite responsible. And really, what was at issue was not so much religious dogma as it was two competing positions of science. I mean, you had scientists on both sides of that issue, just like you had churchmen on both sides of that issue, just like you have on other scientific issues where there's no certainty. But
there are instances of persecution within the church that are documented that these groups never seemed to latch onto. I mean, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake.
Yeah, that was kind of a...
And now she's a saint, right?
Right.
But
that's a complicated issue also, because she got captured as part of a war between the British and the French, and it was the British bishops who tried her. And so, they used canonical procedures, but they were nationalistic. They had an agenda.
You can get the transcripts of her trial on the internet. Did you know that?
Yes, I did. Yes.
And I must say the questions that they're asking her seem legitimate. When you had this vision, what was he wearing? And did you just see his, they seem legitimate and on point. And then her responses for a young girl were just amazing too.
A young, uneducated person.
Yes, that she had remarkable. The wisdom that she had the wisdom to give those responses. And then, of course, we had the persecution, and this goes back. This is an interesting issue of the Knights Templar. Mm-hmm. And I have read so much, and it's involved in conspiracy theories today. And are the Masons a continuation of the Templars? And that was the actual head. Were they worshiping a head? And was it of John the Baptist? And or was it the head of the Shroud of Turin?
And they were also they had a lot of money. There was corruption. Some people said that they were involved in all sorts of
blasphemy,
distasteful things. So I mean,
But I think the party line though now is, I think I was researching it, is that the persecution of the Templars was incorrect. I think. I don't know, but there's this interesting hearing.
I don't know, but I mean, there was a process involved. I mean, it wasn't like it was an illegal act. I mean, I guess they had an opportunity to respond and so forth, and maybe the procedures that they used in those times and were considered ordinary are offensive to modern sensibilities. But there was some effort at there being some kind of process, due process, at least for that, as it was understood in that.
I
age.
wasn't aware of
But
that. I was
in
just,
terms of the historical accusations against him, I mean, I don't know. I think that would be something that would take you a whole lifetime to figure out and obtain some kind of reasoned
it's
basis
interesting.
and judgment.
It's so interesting. You know, were they making all this money and transporting Christians to the Holy Land, or were they the first bankers, or did they find this fortune? I've read all those theories, I guess.
Yeah, and then you had opposition to kings because they're kind of a power that they can't control because they're like an international corporation who's coming in and doing things, and you want to control those assets. So do you have the jealousy of the kings involved? And you had some of that. You had the same problems with the fact that they're independent even from the Pope because they had power in excess of the Pope because they had money and they controlled banks and so forth. So there are a lot of moving parts there, and for that reason, it's not something that somebody who has not studied it intensely
I don't know.
Could give anything but a tentative judgment.
I think someone maybe who has even studied it intensely may not be able to come to all the conclusions necessary. I did think that one of the issues the Templars was that termed an order? Was that an order? Do you know?
The Templars were one of those few orders, monastic military orders.
Okay, and the Jesuits are considered an order also.
Yes, a religious order.
And the Jesuits have been some Catholics were of the opinion that they were there's been some heresy regarding in the Jesuit order. I guess you're familiar with that discussion?
Yes, the Jesuits have had their problems since the Second Vatican Council.
And then right,
So,
and then there's some the Opus Dei group has come under attack as being a fanatic order also.
there's that. I mean, there's accusations with respect to that. They're a tradition-centered order. They're very conservative. They've done tremendous good, and there's a lot of times there's just, frankly, maybe some personal jealousy. I'm sure, like in any human situation, there may be some limited areas of abuse. Their enemies have seized on it and so forth. But generally, I think Opus Dei is a very good organization. I mean, the founder is
Escriva?
Monsignor Escriva. Is a saint. The one who followed him, I think Lopez Portillo, is a saint. So I mean, there's nothing wrong with that order. Although, like anything else, I'm sure you can point to one or two abuses that have occurred with respect to their discipline, or maybe some people who are unhappy, or maybe just personal jealousy because of their success.
Well, obviously there was some propaganda in the popular media through that book, The Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, I mean, they were represented as kind of monsters, and it was just actually kind of nonsense.
I do find it interesting that I believe all the Catholics on the United States Supreme Court are members of Opus Dei. Is that right?
I don't know.
I think so. Well,
that would surprise me.
Well, I know Scalia is.
I didn't know he was a member of Opus
Dei. Yes. Okay. I don't have that fact in front of me. Through reading Scalia, and now the name escapes me. His friend, the Black Supreme Court, Thomas.
Yeah.
Thomas, I believe, is too.
You've got me on that. I have absolutely no knowledge
it fits
about
into the great conspiracy theories. No, I don't know. I thought that I had heard that. Well, and the reason I was talking about these orders is sometimes, I wonder, when these orders, is it hard for the church to keep track of what's going on in these orders? That's what I've thought. Whether it's the Jesuits or the Templars and maybe Opus Dei, I don't know how legitimate some of the other criticisms are. I do know some people think that they're kind of associated with the far-right politics and or fascism, as from Escriva and et cetera.
Ultimately, they're all underneath the auspices of the Pope or the jurisdiction of the Pope. The Pope has a congregation for religious that takes care of them and supervises them. They all are somewhat independent bodies. They all have their own constitutions. They all have their forms of government. They have their own rules. They have their own traditions and so forth. And so they operate somewhat autonomously. That's their purpose. And they all have kind of different emphases in terms of spirituality or in terms of work, apostolic work that they do. But they are all generally supervised by the Congregation for Religious, who is under the Pope. So there would be a means to correct problems that arise out of those things.
Now I've forgotten the order out of Robstown. Father Karapi was a...
The Society of Our Lady of the Most Holy Trinity.
Yes. And...
SALT.
Yeah, and then, of course, then I read the Karapi scandal, alleged, scandals, and he was a member of SALT, and it didn't seem like he was being that... Obviously, when these alleged abuses came to the fore, they did discipline him, but I had just kind of zeroed in lately on some of these orders and whether or not they could be supervised directly,
But they are, and the local bishop also has a role with respect to that. So, and it gets rather complicated, and the orders there's different orders. I mean, and we kind of put them all together. There's personal prelatures, and there's the traditional orders. Some are,
That's why you're here.
Diocese.
You're the only one that knows this
No,
stuff.
I don't know all this stuff. You'd have to talk to a canon lawyer.
Certainly not me.
But you can't just generalize, because it gets kind of complicated. There's a lot of working pieces to the church.
Okay. And then I thought, the other persecution that I've thought of, and I don't know that anybody ever said it, but, Padre Pio wasn't permitted to say Mass for many years. What was the rationale before that?
I have never understood exactly all that. And, my knowledge of Padre Pio is limited. I'm generally favorably disposed towards him. But yeah, I think that there was a lot of, I would call it persecution against him. I think some of it had to do with the unusual nature of his stigmata, the concern that people would focus on that and not the doctrines of the church. I think he tended to be very traditional at a time in the church when things were kind of going crazy, and a lot of people in the church would have frowned upon his traditional piety, and I think that had something to do with it as well. Yeah,
that obviously he's looked upon very favorably in Italy. He has been. He is a saint.
Yeah, he was canonized. So
canonized?
All those things kind of are in the past. I think he displayed a superior life of virtue. I think he was always obedient to his superiors, and that's some of the things that you look at.
I'm like one of those people that look at like some of these miraculous powers. Bifurcation, the power to be in two places at once. Supposedly the ability to know your sins before you tell them, etc. Have you read some of those powers of Padre Pio or something? And I've made jokes they should make him into a superhero or something with some of these.
Some of those things are absolutely remarkable, but
I think they're documented too.
They are documented.
Well.
That's the thing. I mean, it kind of forces upon you to rethink. If you're a materialist, to rethink that there may be greater things than our philosophy allows for. In other words, there's some striking spiritual phenomena that have occurred in his life, which bilocation is one of them, as well as the ability to read souls.
I made jokes in court when I had to be in two places at once about I don't have the power. I'd like to have the power of bifurcation like Padre Pio, but it usually means like with blank stares, or I guess that's maybe that's too obscure a reference. I don't know.
He's not the only saint that has that, where he's been seen, or he or she has been seen in two places at the same time, documented.
He was, I think, there's a period of time in order to make someone a saint of, is it 25 or 50 years after their death? Is there a period?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Wasn't it changed with John Paul II?
There was a change in the process. I think John Paul II, if he didn't initiate it, he certainly used it, and it was kind of eased up. A lot of the process was eased up, and so yes, as a result, you can have a little faster track towards canonization than you used to have in the past.
I think that they discussed making Mother Teresa a saint, shortening the time period, and John Paul II actually didn't allow it now. But I do think it was changed with John Paul II. Is that right? Did I understand what you were saying? Or
yeah, I think John Paul II passed the processes that they're using now, which allowed for things to go a little faster and removed some of the rules. For example, one of the things that they removed, they used to have the devil's advocate, which they had somebody appointed whose sole purpose was to raise all the bad things about this person. So he was
interesting.
And they've removed.
Well, the media does that.
Yeah, well, to some extent, yes.
But I'm just joking.
But they don't do it. They don't do it in a lawful setting, with process and with evidence. But that office was taken. So there's some softening. There was also a reduction in the numbers of miracles that were required, and so some people have criticized that. It's 2 now, but it used to be more. It used to be more. I can't remember the specifics.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, I hope I haven't excommunicated myself for you, Mr. Greenwell.
I hope we haven't either.
Knows quite a bit about the Catholic Church. I want to thank you for coming on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Good night.